my experience and the anecdotal experience that I've heard from many other women in the music industry is that if they had any kind of musical performing ability at all, they were only really allowed to do one thing or encouraged to do one thing, and that is sing.
Hi, my name's Jay Musaman, and I wanted to make this podcast to highlight the women who are working in music production, in the hope that it will spur more women into having the confidence to not just produce their own music, but call themselves producers. After the critically acclaimed release of her first 2 EPs as an artist, Rookes has pivoted gracefully into the role of record producer. A recent recipient of the Help Musicians Do It Differently 2020 grant to complete and release her first LP, Pop Not Pop, she is also an awardee of the MPG 2020 scholarship. Welcome to She's Doing It, So I'm Doing It.
I was brought up in a musical house. Like, there's no getting around that reality. I was brought up in a house with 2 very musical parents as an only child, so it was quite an intense experience in terms of just being around a lot of different influences. Their palette is quite broad, and so I've inherited that. So they would listen to like pop music, folk music. There was a lot of opera in the house, which is quite unusual because my mother is very well. My mother's very working class. My dad's middle class, but my mother can sing to an operatic standard. Like, her voice is something else. And so I was always around it, but I wasn't very keen to make it my job, partly because no one had ever encouraged me to do so until I hit my early 20s. And I'd been actively demoralized and discouraged at different points in my musical activities, but also I felt like music was a bit of a source of baggage for both my parents as well. So it took me like a minute to figure out that I could have a career out of it. And by then I'd actually spent about 10 years doing something else.
Yeah.
Trying not to be a musician. You can see how very effective that was.
I'm interested in because I kind of denied that I wanted to be a musician for a huge portion of my life. And I wonder do you think that happens to women more than men?
Yes.
Growing up? And is there a reason?
I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that, I've talked about this in other spaces quite a lot, but in music industry, the landscape is shifting because we're forcing it to shift right now, which is great. And it's wonderful to find other people who are sort of your compatriots in that desire to cultivate a different industry with more egalitarian view. But my experience and the anecdotal experience that I've heard from many other women in the music industry is that if they had any kind of musical performing ability at all, they were only really allowed to do one thing or encouraged to do one thing, and that is sing. And the problem is the fact that in music industry, particularly in the UK, because we're one of the world leaders in music industry, it's highly competitive. Only 20% of signings to labels are women right now, and that's right now. That wasn't even 10 years ago. Yeah. That's now. Yeah. So it's a case of there's only really one job we can have. It's incredibly hard to succeed in it. You often either have to have connections or money or both to make the 1% at the very top. And no one really talks openly about what it is to be a middle-class musician, to do other roles within the industry, make a decent living, and not just be squished into this tiny cookie cutter singer, like make it like sink or swim kind of role.
How did you then move into music production? I'm sure a lot of things happen, but
they did, yes. Yeah. Well, when I was in my first year of university, I was invited to be a backing vocalist in a house band, and so I was very slowly getting my sea legs in terms of performing live in a more kind of public space. But I wanted to write my own songs. I couldn't get anyone to help me because none of the male musicians who I encountered, with a very small exception of like maybe one or two. Hi, Paul and Kevin, if you're listening, no one really encouraged me to make music. None of them would show me how to use any DAWs, and YouTube and tutorials, that kind of thing didn't really exist back then in the way that it exists now. And so I just got a MacBook because I had to anyway, because I was studying. And I wanted to get a MacBook in particular because it had GarageBand. And so I just started making demos, and it was very rudimentary. I didn't even know how the kick drum worked or how samples or presets or anything worked. I couldn't find how to do a kick drum.
Yeah.
So I was just whacking my computer and recording it through the tiny mic at the top.
Oh, so the actual sound of you whacking the computer
was thumping my computer with my fingers to create that kick for my first demo. I think I've still got it somewhere. And I know my parents have. They're very fond of it. And so that was literally how I was starting, was using the tiny mic and just trying to make noise and capture it. And eventually I figured out, as I said, how presets and samples and digital instruments and software worked. It took time, but I got there. And in the end, I formed, at the end of my university years, I kind of rounded out my my kind of big live band work and had started a little folk band. And we started recording demos in what we call band camps, which were like weekends where we would get our mattresses and put them against the walls and throw a blanket and make a little sound booth, and we would create demos of the stuff that we had been playing live in pubs. I just kind of got to the point because that band fell apart and I had to move to London because I couldn't get a job in the Midlands. It was part of a really bad time for job hunting. And I was offered one in London, so I came down here, and I only had one music friend here, and that was Ben Parker. And Ben Parker was a producer, and I did not know that. He was just a musician that I knew, and we'd done some I'd opened for him with his one of his bands. And so now I was stuck in London writing sad songs about the fact that I didn't have a band anymore, and I was lonely and heartbroken and just generally a bit miserable. But I'm a good songwriter, and Ben recognized that. And so I dinged him a demo because I was like, you're the only person I know in London who's musical. Is this any good? And he loved it. And so we started working together. And what I slowly learned through working with him was the fact that I was co-producing, because a lot of the stuff that we were using, I was using in the demos and bouncing out of GarageBand, made it into the final records. And so we made 2 EPs together. And also there was another co-producer, another friend of Ben's called Jimmy Sims, who does lots of work with George Ezra and things now. And so we were all kind of like a little team. We were making stuff together. It was a very collaborative, very enjoyable process. And they basically gave me a crash course in how to make a record. And there was a lot of things that they would do and I would watch. And sometimes I'd ask questions and they'd explain things as they went along. They were very patient. And sometimes I would just watch them do it and then Google it later.
Yeah.
And very slowly I got more confident. And at the end of the second EP that I'd made with them, I was very aware that I had gained a hell of a lot of skills and that I could, and that the stuff that I was making was better than a demo. Yeah. And so I decided to start making a full-length album that I was going to write and produce and perform myself. And because that felt less scary than trying to offer my services to other people and have the pressure of it being someone else's material that I was learning to do this with. And then it really snowballed because that decision happened about 2.5 months before COVID hit. And then the pandemic experience then heavily informed my pivot into production and the fact that it just became, I was trapped in one room. There was nothing else to do except become a beast at production.
How would you encourage somebody like, I don't know, young girl who's interested in doing this to push past that?
I talk to women, gender minorities all the time. All the time. It's like a constant dialogue that I'm having in my DMs in 2% Rising, which is our network. And a lot of it is dependent on what people want to get out of their career. And I think that's probably the most important question you can ask first, because most of the time, a lot of us in the industry, especially women, because there aren't many role models. And every time I say women, I may say it, I mean women and gender minorities. I'm always trying to be inclusive of non-binary and trans people. They are my people. So if I slip up on that, lovely listeners, forgive me. Yeah, it depends on where you want to go and what you want to do with your career, because a lot of us come in and we feel like there's only so many things we can do. If we start getting into production and we realize that is a goal, then that is going to be a different trajectory than if you want to be a self-producing artist, or if you want to become a DJ, or if you want, it depends. And I think what's important is for women and gender minorities to really start thinking about this. We cannot all be Dua Lipa. It's not going to happen. And having spent a decade in the industry now, let's not count how many years old I am. I can testify to the fact that I think all star power exists and not many people have it.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, if you want to be an artist, decide what kind of an artist you want to be, what kind of an impact you want to have, what kind of an audience you want to reach. And that will dictate how you go about equipping yourself to do that. If people want to remain artists but want to get a background in production, which I highly recommend, especially engineering, because it will make your conversations with your production team when you're making your record in the studio, everyone will be able to speak the same language. It makes the whole thing much more enjoyable, much more fluid. And then, like, I would encourage people to pursue short courses, like everyone across the board in engineering. You can find them for every single door. Yeah. Everywhere. And some communities admittedly are less misogynist than others, but there are wonderful courses out there. Like I have like a handful of my friends who are badass producers and who run courses. One of the best ones at Ableton that I've come across is my friend Lena, who is LNA, does audio stuff on YouTube. And
I'm interviewing next.
Yeah, do it, because
that's exciting.
Lena is wonderful, and I've worked with her a few times, and she is just phenomenal and completely herself, which is really, really deeply refreshing. There are other ones on Logic. Like I picked up a lot of tips and tricks on Logic courses, but there are loads of them out there, and you can literally Google it now and find a myriad of stuff. If you're looking to produce seriously as a producer, which is the decision that I made, like I'm releasing as an artist, but my goal is to become a producer for other people, because that is a better fit for me, and that's something that I discovered.
I'm actually interested. Sorry to interrupt, but it was one of my
okay.
questions: is what made you decide that? Because I like producing my own music, and I'm still learning, but I don't know if I want to do it for other people. I'm still thinking about it. So I was really curious as to what made you realize that that's what you enjoyed doing.
Well, I realized during the pandemic that production was my favorite part.
Yeah.
It was my favorite part of the whole process. Why would I not just do that all the time? And also I realized I've been performing on stages for 25 years, which is a really long time.
Yeah.
And it has only brought me a limited amount of joy. And because it's so tough out there for female and gender minority artists, it still is. We're working on it, but it still is. The deeply traumatic and difficult day to day of being a live performer, of touring, how expensive it is, how little support you receive, how you're constantly walking into venues and wondering who's going to be rude to me today.
Yeah.
Like, you know, things like that. None of it robbed me of my joy of performing, and it has done for 25 years, and I've had enough. I just thought, you know what, I've now got to a point in my life where I want to be as successful as I possibly can. I want to do the thing that I love. I want to reduce the damage that could be done to me through this industry.
Yeah.
Could I just make music for other people? And so during the pandemic, I started experimenting with that. I started inviting people to work on songwriting, on arrangement, on production with me. Some of those projects flourished. Some of them only got so far, and then life got in the way for a lot of people. It was a very difficult time. A lot of people managing a lot of hard factors, including myself. And so, but that whole experience of starting to get on that situation, and then also being those artists' champion, like being their cheerleader, being in a position where I could promote them, and that gives, like, lifting people up gives me a lot of joy. It gives me a lot of deep satisfaction. Yeah. So that was a new facet of my role. There we go. And so I just lent into it, and I naturally just started to enjoy my life a lot more. as a result. And also I managed to start finding my way into rooms, into conversations, into industry spaces that when I was just an artist, no one wanted me there. Because there are the artists, in terms of the number of artists out there, we have reached beyond a saturation point for people because technology has enabled everyone to be an artist. And that's just a natural side effect of what's happened. But there still aren't enough producers. People want to talk to producers, and there is an awareness in the industry. Admittedly, it's probably about 80% lip service still, but there is a 20% pushing through who really do want to see more women in production, more women in technical roles. And because my neurodiversity means that if I get deeply invested and interested in something, I can become very proficient at it very quickly. That then only accelerated the process. So I'm very conscious that I have been able to accomplish more in 2 years than a lot of people. I'm still very early career, but that's true.
I mean, it's something that stood out when I was doing my research, and we can actually talk about that. The fact that you got the Do It Differently fund in 2020, and then you got a scholarship as well. Was that the same year?
Same year, Music Producers Guild.
What happened? Tell me that. What happened?
What the hell happened? I'm still asking myself that. So there was a very rapid progression. I was working with a manager at the time called Chris. We're not working together anymore. We parted ways not long after, but he did as much for me as he could within that time. And one of the things we did a lot of, because the pandemic hit mid-tour, so I lost all my money. So we were in a position where we had to make a plan very fast. And so we also started applying for a lot of things. We'd made a plan for me to create my full-length record and for that to be the production guinea pig.
Right.
And I was going to record it on YouTube in kind of these episodes that demonstrated how I was writing and laying the foundations of the production for the track.
Yeah.
Which was a hell of a lot of work. But and the funny thing was, not many people found it. But what it was a record of what I was doing. And so I used that as basically a point of reference to apply for the Do It Differently fund to complete the production on that record and to release it, which I am now finally doing. They very graciously gave me an extension because 2021 was a terrible year. Then I got that grant, and I pretty much just made a decision to mostly work for other people, which the timing was like, oh no, like, oh, they gave me money.
Now I've got to do something.
And now I have to do it. And I was grateful, I was delighted, but I didn't expect to get it. We applied for so many things between probably April and July of 2020. I did more applications and I hate them. My neurodiversity hates them. So you can imagine I was like filling out a paragraph and screaming into a pillow and then going and filling out another paragraph. And so it was the worst, but we got better at it as we went along. And so by the time it hit the summer, we'd now got the Do It Differently grant. And that was like, okay, well, I guess that gives some structure to what I'm doing. And then I'd used the same YouTube series to apply for the Music Producers Guild scholarship. That was a punt. I mean, God bless the Music Producers Guild. They are phenomenal and they have really supported my career pretty much since I started waving my hands in the air, being like, over here. They gave me £9,000 to study with them, like
Amazing.
a day a week, essentially. Wow. But then I got a certificate at the end.
On top of everything else she's been doing, Rookes created 2% Rising, a project that was made with her friend to help support women and gender minorities working in music production in studios. The initiative has taken off and been championed by NME as part of its Rebuild music programme.
2% Rising is a women and gender minority studio talent network that is mostly based on Facebook right now. But we have plans to extend it. And it's been a tough few months for the three of us who run it, so it's all been a bit slow, but we are slowly getting back on the horse. It's because we've all gone full time in freelancing in our jobs, so we are a bit all over the place, but we are slowly drawing back together and doing our best to support each other. So it's myself, Katie Tavini, and Suze Cooper. We run it together. We all do different things. I'm obviously a producer. Katie is a mastering engineer. Katie Tavini of indie engineering fame, and Suze Cooper is a sound designer and podcaster. So it's quite nice because we do have a spread of stuff between us that we specialize in. And it started because Katie and I, who had worked together previously on my second EP, and then just decided that we would become friends because we were clearly on the same wavelength. And this was before I knew that I was neurodiverse, and so was Katie, which is quite funny. I feel like we all just slowly draw together. And we're all just operating on a completely different wavelength to everybody else. And so we had made friends and started to kind of have these really long phone calls because Katie lives in Brighton and I live in London, and we would just bitch about the same stuff. And we needed to have a vent because we were both struggling with the fact that we both felt very isolated in our jobs.
Yeah.
And we only knew a handful of women and gender minorities who were in production roles. And so that was demoralizing, and we were lacking role models, and we were doing a lot of peer mentoring, really, in terms of, I mean, Katie's way further in her career than I am, and because this is my second career, but she really was feeling it, and our conversations were getting longer and longer and longer. And then I had this sort of idea. I had the name because the Billboard 2018 statistic had gone around the internet again, and everyone had gone, oh no, only 2% of commercially successful record releases were produced by a woman. This is so terrible. And then obviously the industry wept and did nothing, because the industry is good at doing that. Lots and lots of lip service, as I said. I had this name 2% Rising in my head, and I basically contacted Katie and I said, I've had this idea. Would you like to do it with me? And we'll see how many we can find, because there's got to be more of us.
Yeah.
But we don't know where we don't know where everybody is. And you know, and part of the gatekeeping vibe of music industry is to do with, you know, if we're gonna have to compete with anyone, then the women can probably be the first out the door. So so we were struggling with that, and so we said, all right, let's just start a private Facebook group and we'll pop a banner up and we'll create a little video that explains what we're doing. And we popped it up, and between us we found about 50 people, and we were also conscious because we were going through another wave of Brexit nonsense at the time, and we wanted to make sure that we were fostering connections with people in the EU as well. So we made it just the UK and EU. That did not last long, because in about 5 days we were at 150, and word had got out so quickly. And we sat down, I mean, I sat down with Dan Gumbel, who's one of our amazing allies, does pretty much supports everything that Katie and I do, which is wicked. And he's been one of the kind of editors and writers for Pro Sound News, and is now working at Headliner magazine. And we sat down to talk about doing like some kind of announcement that this existed. Then the next day, the first lockdown. But the weird bit was the fact that it started growing even more rapidly because suddenly everyone was stuck at home and forced onto the internet and looking for connection. And so we were just getting piles of people applying to join, like, you know, started off kind of like weekly and then daily, and it happened in waves.
And was this people who are full-time in the industry, or people looking to get started, or, you know?
All over the place, every level of access, really. We were getting complete novices. We were getting people who were interested but didn't know where to begin. We got people who were artists who were looking to like sharpen their production knowledge. We were getting industry kind of heavyweights, like we got some Grammy winners that were suddenly a part of the group. And the Music Producers Guild, which was at the time and still is happily 50% gender split on the board of directors, were threw their weight behind it as well. And so that was then massive. And so we were just kind of riding this wave of momentum. And we have been ever since. And we just started creating resources for people while they were trapped inside, by sourcing them from within the community, because we came up with 3 goals. One was to get people to connect with each other, to find each other.
Mm-hmm.
2 was to resource people, to enable them to grow their skills. And the 3rd was to help them to connect together, to build projects and careers from within the community. Because part of the problem a lot of people were experiencing was this idea of like, if you want to gain knowledge, the only people you can ask are men because they're the only ones who have all the knowledge. And then that creates a power dynamic that often becomes demoralizing in lots of different, both social and professional ways. So not all the time, as I experienced with Ben and Jimmy, that was very empowering. But that experience I gathered anecdotally over time was a rarity.
In part 2 of this interview, Jen will be breaking her track Consent down and how she built up this big pop rock track that deals with a really difficult topic. Stay tuned for part 2.
So welcome. This is Consent. How would you like to do this?
Just feel free to just, what usually happens is I sit and listen and you tell me what you did.
Okay. What did I do? Oh man. Okay.
It's kind of like, you know, was there a challenge on it that you had to overcome or something you're particularly proud of? And it's kind of just to show people how, you know, it's not what's behind it all, because I think sometimes the whole thing can be overwhelming.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, the major challenge around this track wasn't actually in the production, it was in the writing, because the subject matter is how do we say it, a bit spicy. So obviously the title kind of gives it away. In a weird kind of way, once it was written, it sort of freed me because it was out of my head and into my door. So once I had created the basic concept, which really started with I wrote it called Progressively on acoustic guitar, none of which appears in the final product.
So because I jump in there, because I heard a acoustic version of this that you posted.
There is,
and I was curious which one came first. Was it the guitar version that was originally written that became this?
Well, what's ironic is there was a guitar version, but it wasn't the one that you've heard. It's so the acoustic arrangement that you can find on Tinternet at the moment is basically probably at least 10 to 15 BPM slower, and also it's kind of a picking style of delivery. It's meant to kind of communicate more of the heartbreak of the lyrics, so very ballad like. However, I very much wrote it in like sort of, I don't know if this is a reference that will translate, but like Blink 182 on the guitar kind of playing, like, you know, like how you would play an electric guitar but ultimately doing it with an acoustic guitar. So like when Radio 1 would do live lounges with Blink 182, that's the kind of style that I wrote it in. So it was always an angry rock song. And then once I'd written it, I started putting a 4/4 kick in, because I do love a 4/4, and that's still the version that we have here in you know, what I've basically done is compressed certain elements of the mix, because the mix the main project got way too big. It was 50 odd tracks. I was running a lot of sophisticated MPE software in there, and manipulating data and things like that. And so unfortunately Logic kept breaking down every 5 minutes and I had to bounce things out in chunks, which had pros and cons, I learned as I was mixing it with Katie later. But Katie's remarkable and worked with me on a lot of all of the mixes for this album. And so what we ended up doing was kind of compressing stuff in the center and then stuff that was panned and things like that in those areas. So I got the 4/4 kick in and I started messing around with my electric guitar, just doing the kind of the same pattern that I had written with it, but it didn't quite sit right, which was interesting. And so what I then ended up doing was getting my bass. I started off using just a bass preset, started off with a cello preset, because sometimes I just like to replace bass with cello. And I got a lot of MPE software because I used to work for Rolly. Love you, Rolly. And so I basically had created this I remember, I can't remember, there was a particular song, I think it was probably Starlight by Muse, where there's a bum 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 bum. Like it's a very kind of rhythmic, uniform bass pattern that runs all the way through in terms of the picking. And so I put that in to create that sense of momentum instead of the electric guitar kind of rhythmic strumming. And that suddenly gave it a very different, much heavier kind of feeling than I
is that
had.
there? Can we hear that?
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah. So, well, a quick note before we do, I'm just going to solo it for you. Because what actually happened was it evolved. The oh, this is going to be interesting. I'm really hoping nothing crashes. What happened was I wanted the bass to get bigger, so I then doubled the signal with another bass preset, which made it bigger, but I still wanted it bigger still. So what I then did was I mirrored the same bass part, playing it live on my bass through a fuzz pedal, and then I just noodled around with kind of the balances of the different effects I was using, because obviously bass as Katie says, bass is wide. Bass takes up a lot of space in tracks if you don't mix it well. So what Katie and I ended up doing it was actually popping it through one of her outboard compressors and compressing those 3 signals into one signal, and then adding it back into the mix. So this is what we got. This is the 3 signals compressed. And then down to just 1. But you can hear the attack of the cello pluck when it's all together, which is one of the things that makes it so impactful. And this is where I've started adding the bass walking fingers in. And then a bit later, it will switch over to everything again. So that then just ran like a thread all the way through the track. And it was so satisfying. And so I then started being like, okay, well, so we've got, I started building percussion around that. So then there's the 4/4. And then I started throwing in some stuff, I think. So there's, yeah. So the what is essentially like, it's like a kind of marching snare. These were all part of Rolly's sadly defunct iOS app called Noise, which I ended up creating loops for this project on that, and I did that for a lot of the album. But it was very nice to switch up the way that I was inputting and generating stuff for the track. So there were a few different kind of sounds that I designed in the end that became quite interesting. I'm just going to see if I can find some for you. Yeah. So there's this kind of industrial sound in the background.
Yeah.
That's sort of like a psh kind of noise. It's almost like a valve releasing or something, like something on a train that you would hear. And part of that came through basically me taking these samples that were in the Rolly Noise app and then using MPE to kind of to basically bend the sound or manipulate the tonality of it in the data, and then throw those sounds into Logic and cut them into samples, and then to play them again using a MIDI controller like a drum pad. So there was a lot of transformation, really, particularly around the percussion that took place. And then I started messing around with different presets in terms of synthesizers, of which Rolly has many. Equator, I think I also used some, there's Equator 1 and 2 now, but I think I only had Equator at the time. and then they have Cypher and Strobe as well.
I'm not familiar with these. Are they hardware or
These
plugins?
are these are all plugins. These are all software, and they're synth engines. So you go in them and they've got like nice big synth libraries. And so I was looking for stuff that almost sounded, a lot of sound design techniques are all over this album, and particularly in terms of the more aggressive sounds, Consent has a lot of them. So there's some synthesizers that I threw in that were kind of a bit more sweeping to give it a bit more of an epic feel. And then over here, I wanted stuff that was always going to give momentum. So something I started messing around with was I still wanted it to sound electric, but the electric guitar wasn't really working. So I basically ended up taking synth presets that sounded like guitars and putting them on our arpeggiated pattern. So it sounded like shredding, which is what happened here with this particular kind of like, yeah. These are 2 or 3 different synths that. So I think that's actually a preset called Sweet. I think it's called Sweet Child Guitar. So it's a reference. Yeah. And I just basically popped an arpeggiated pattern on, hit the D, and just let it ride. And it just sounds like someone going like that. Really cool. So really fun. I'm just going to check. Yeah. And then there was like, I did lots of arpeggiating and playing around with stuff like that. I also did popped like a piano preset through a tremolo. So you've got that here. So everything was rhythmic and everything was designed to keep a sense of moving forward. Partly to do with the fact that it reflected the kind of the tonality of the lyrics, which are to do with being very angry. And when you are angry, you're very motivated, you know, and so I wanted there to be like a sense of accessing that anger and have it motivate you.
When I was listening to it, I did notice with the vocals, you have a very particular sound, in my opinion. Like, I really like it as well. So I was curious about, and it sounded very wide in certain places. So I was curious as to how you approach vocals and what you did, because it did sound so singular, is that the right word? You know what I mean?
Singular. Very good word. I like it. Yeah, it did. So the vocals again went through a lot of transformation. I wanted to leave it as dry as dust, but no one seemed to think that was a good idea. And I understand why, and it's to do with the idea that every physical space in the world has a reverb. It has a sound. All spaces have a sound, but we don't necessarily realize that unless we're paying attention to it. So it did sound very unnatural. Now, I personally enjoyed that, but I sort of got other people's feelings around it, and they found it hard to appreciate the song because they felt like in certain places that can work. Like Billie Eilish does it really well, or Phineas production for Billie Eilish does it really well. When it's very close vocals, very compressed, it can work beautifully. But for this, I was really letting rip in a very rock star kind of way in terms of the vocals, particularly on the choruses, and it wasn't quite sitting right for people when I tested it. So there were a few different things I did. I did parallel compression, parallel reverb, and I kind of took notes from different people around that in terms of different techniques to try, using multiple compressors. Often I would put a compressor on the channel itself and then have another bus that had more compressors on to basically tweak, and ditto for reverb, to tweak until I got the right thing. So I had a strip that was lead vocal compression, that I then dialed in and dialed out of the different parallel kind of tracks that were mirroring mirroring the same kind of signal in terms of the vocal. I also comped, like, I did a lot of vocal comping rather than singing from top to bottom. We've got 10 minutes. We're okay. So there were a few things that I added onto those channels. I did some slapback delay, which I kind of got. I didn't really mean to use Arctic Monkeys as a reference, but that style of kind of indie rock, a lot of artists use slapback delay for the lead vocal, and I think Arctic Monkeys kind of really made it popular. Or it might have been the Kooks, but it was kind of around that 2010s sort of indie vibe, which was kind of band music from that era is something that I naturally refer to a lot. I also used for different chunks of the vocal some of Valhalla's Supermassive. I also had one reverb on a bus that I called the huge verb. So I basically took like a cathedral size reverb on Space Designer and again just dialed it in on having kept it on a separate bus, in and out, and automated it at different points for each of those lead vocal channels. But also there was some stuff that Ruby Smith, who's a remarkable engineer, works for Sony now, gave me some great tips in terms of getting the vocal polish up to par, in terms of using a doubler, in terms of using a vocal rider to kind of smooth out certain sections, kind of where and how to use a de-esser appropriately. But also there was a lot, Katie and I went back and forth on EQing this vocal as well, because my tendency was to roll too much off of the kind of middle frequencies of my voice, and that made Katie very upset, because she was basically saying all pop voices sound like that, but your voice doesn't sound like that, and that's what makes it special. And that was actually a really good thing for me to hear, and I didn't feel like it was a piece of criticism. I thought it was something really useful to learn from. So I put some of the color back in those sort of middle frequencies. I kind of dialed down the EQ in a few places, as you can see here, but I left a nice chunk of it here, and kind of knocked some mud out there, and obviously rolled off the lower end. That was sort of the compromise that was reached between the two of us, because I still wanted it to sound like pop, but I also wanted it to sound like rock, and I wanted it to sound like me. So
it does, like it as I said, it really stands out.
So, but it's also been quite interesting seeing how people respond to that, because for some people, they're so used to hearing a pop voice in a particular frequency kind of space, that they found my voice off-putting and they couldn't digest the song. So that's to do with how much it's that kind of style of very high kind of upper mid pop vocals is ingrained in our consciousness now as what a pop voice should be, whereas realistically there are no rules as to what a pop voice should be. But the last thing to probably mention is the background vocals, because they contributed enormously to what was happening, and especially I used a lot of fun things here. As you can see, these are all kind of vocals that have been essentially, look, I've just got more BVs stacked and stacked and compressed and stacked again, all the way down, as you can see, like the layers and layers and layers of them. But I love stacking vocals. I think they're really impactful, and they give a sense of gang representation or band representation on a track, even if it's just a solo artist, if they're done right. And especially because I wanted this track to keep people on their toes and to constantly keep surprising people. So, for example, the transition from chorus 1 into the instrumental and then into verse 2 was very important. And that's where the backing vocals really kick in. So around here. So you've got... So that kind of oomph that comes up, that's actually me saying the word huh, like huh, like the A-team, and then dropping that through basically a pitch shifter and adding some effects, like a little bit of reverb, a bit of fuzz onto it, and it created that rumble that I then layered with just saying huh again and compressed it again, layered and compressed, put it all together, and that's what you end up with, is this weird kind of
Okay, it's so cool, I love it.
And then it comes back at the end. You've got like loads of it. So no, I should not have done. No, I should not have done. Oh, oh.
really
So
gets you. It's such a cool sound.
it is, right? And it's nice because it gives you a little bit of woo,
Yeah,
you
it
know.
does.
And it's meant to, the whole point of it was to sound big because I mean, this is a song about the rage of being victimized and getting your autonomy back and recognizing what has happened to you, especially if it's something that's really, really difficult and traumatizing. And how do you, it's a very, very long journey to get a sense of ownership back over yourself and figuring out how to process and own your experiences in a way that doesn't mean that you feel like you are a victim all the time.
Yeah.
So I wanted, and that is those are very big, complex feelings that people don't really know how to talk about.
Yeah.
But if I could find a way for people to sing them, then maybe that could start a conversation.
Yeah.
And if they could dance, then even better. So that sort of informed my approach production wise to everything I was doing. I wanted it to be big, I wanted it to be loud, I wanted it to be tense, but I also wanted it to be very rhythmic and inspire people to literally get on their feet. Okay, so there was one more thing. Actually two more things. I do use strings all the time because I've been lucky enough to have access to MPE strings through Rolly's stuff. I did use a bit of labs as well, Spitfire labs on this one. But it was nice to just sort of have it run alongside the kind of the more textural synthesizer stuff because it allowed there to be something recognizable and for it not to just sound alien to people. So there's kind of chunks of it here that just undercut the chord structure. Some of it is better than others. But I panned those as well, depending on where it felt like they sat best in the song structure. I am a big fan of panning, of dropping things into mono and then panning them into different spaces, and everything is in stereo all the time. But the electric guitar did make it back in. It finally kind of graced the latter end of the production process. Just because there were certain parts that I wanted a bit more emphasis. So I did create some nice big muff sounds. I wish it wasn't called that, but there you are. Here we go. So that was just sitting underneath the big choruses. But it took kind of all those other layers to make sure that it sounded right in terms of where it was situated. And then I added in more basically layers over here. And it was nice as well because the kind of the muff rhythmic was then just undergirding the bass. So when you throw the bass in as well, obviously it really does sound quite wonderful. And then the last thing I think was the electric guitar lead riff, which is playing the da 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 da, which is and actually that was one of the first visionary things that I had that just kind of dropped into my head as I was thinking, how the hell am I going to produce this? I knew quite early that this would appear, which is these little kind of moments. And that again is synthesizer. That is the synthesized electric guitar preset rather than picking it. And that's partly because I'm not a good enough guitar player to do it. I did try, just not accomplished enough. But it was nice as well because I started noodling with a couple of other bits like the vibraphone over here, which... And I think I always encourage people to really give time to ear candy towards the end of their production process because people's attention spans are like mosquitoes. And that's partly cultural. I mean, but for me, that is a constant state of living because of my neurodiversity, because I have a very short attention span. So I just assume everyone gets bored easily because I do. And then I cater to that. But that seems to work out quite well in this day and age.
Find it hard. It's one of the things that I know I need to do the most. I find it the hardest is just ear candy, vocal ear candy,
Mm.
everything ear candy. Do you find it hard to come up with it, or do you just love it?
I don't find it hard to come up with if it's instruments. If it's my voice, I hate it because I
Yeah.
just feel so fucking pretentious. Like, who wants to hear me trying to be Mariah Carey? Like, no one. But people like it, and
Mhm.
so a lot of it is just honestly, I just have to pretend. I just have to pretend that I care about it and do it with conviction and pretend that I'm somebody else. But also, I sort of give myself permission to fuck around with my voice as and create samples and things like that. So if I create vocal a vocal kind of little bit of ear candy, a little like hook or a flick or something. I'm sure there's a proper word for it, but I don't know what it is. I don't have to keep it as it is. It doesn't have to sound like a voice. Like I can drop it through a vocoder if I want to, or I can mess with it. I can shift the octaves up and down, or I can, in terms of pitch or formant, or I give myself permission to manipulate my voice if I like the part, but I don't like my voice doing it. You've got to live with it. And if every time you listen to it, you're just like, oh, when you hear like that one section, then that's no good. So yeah, so I do give myself permission to noodle around with things if I can't cope with the utter wankiness of listening to myself do that.
As I develop in production, it's something I'm
Mm,
still afraid to do is layer up loads of vocals. How
yeah.
important is that, and how much does it affect that big sound?
I think if you're creating a big track, it's essential. I mean, the doubler, like using a vocal doubler, I just use a free one, I think. Let
Hmm.
me try and pull it up. Yeah,
Oh yeah,
which
that
is
one.
yeah,
Isotopes, isn't it?
isotopes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's very good. And it allows you to kind of try different ways of making your voice sound more full. But I think also, did I use a slightly? Yeah, I used a different EQ on one of my parallel reverb tracks here. You can see it over here. This is
Hmm.
a different EQ to this one. So in terms of creating fuller sounds,
Hmm.
um, because especially in pop music, the voice is kind of everything,
Yeah.
um, which is hard when it's yours. So yeah, so basically doing running parallel EQ, compression, and reverb, and messing around with different different kind of compositions or composites of those factors can make a big difference also about how you feel about your voice and what it is capable of.
If you want to hear more about Rookes' new LP, Pop Not Pop, or get some more information on 2% Rising, make sure you follow her on Instagram at www.instagram.com/IamRooks. If this is the first time you're tuning into this series, check out the other episodes at Narc Magazine. You can find us on Spotify or watch the animated version at www.youtube.com/Narc Magazine TV.